the two sort of cores to it are, one, exploring and spending time out exploring, and maybe give you a few crazy examples. And the second is art, and using art as a way of helping you observe and think about what you're seeing and thinking about what you're exploring. So it may not be your normal way of looking at exploration, but in our experience, we find it a very effective way of getting people to actually see more, do more, and think more from the explorations they're doing. Irene and I have spent quite a lot of time wandering around. Unlike many people that do explorations, we've actually lived and worked in quite a few of these places. So over the last 20 years, I think I've worked in 16 countries. I lived, and we actually met in Alaska, working for the US Forest Service, where we did 2 long seasons. For those of you who are younger, you might not be able to believe a day when there was not a mobile phone, there was not a GPS, there wasn't even actually a decent map. So when we were working in Alaska, you got dropped off by helicopter in the middle of nowhere with an aerial photograph and a compass, and told to get on with it. Quite interesting. So we did 2 years of that, and got on with it, and we're still here. Bear stories and all the rest withstanding. As of course you can imagine, there's plenty of those. We also lived for a couple of years or 2.5 years in Tanzania, in a very remote area, which was about 7 hours drive in a Land Cruiser from the nearest town. So medical attention was a bit brief, a bit exciting. And in between those things, we've done lots of other stuff, working in Nicaragua for a period of time, climbed a peak just over 6,000 meters in Nepal that hadn't been climbed very many times before. And I thought, wow, that's very exciting. Till I realised the local guy had already been up and put the fixed ropes in for me, and all I had to do was push a blooming Jumar up. So, you know, a lot of these big mountain climbs are not quite what you think and you see when you see it on the telly or on the big films. Some poor guy's already been up with a massive coil of rope. I mean, these are big coils. And believe you me, I used to build mountain fencing and have to carry the wire up the mountain. So I know what it feels to carry that stuff. But these guys are doing it at 6,000 meters. And we were on sheer ice walls and they're still going up with this blasted coil. Incredible. So, you know, I think the message for me as I've done all these travels and wandered around is that actually, you know what? Somebody's already been there. And that got us reflecting a lot, and we've talked a lot about this. Exploration is really about you, and it's your choices, your places you go to. And just give you a few examples. We'll talk about the age of exploration, and I went to a thing at the Royal Geographic Society, which was fascinating, Weekend of Explore. Lots of stuff about explorers going to all these amazing places. And I did turn around to the person beside me and said, somebody was living there 2,500 years ago. How the hell was that exploring? And then I went to live in Tanzania, and I was out in the middle of nowhere in the bush. And the usual story that everybody tells that spent any time in these wilder places, you're the first white man I've seen in 40 years. Okay, well, fascinating, but I was the first in 40 years. Those guys knew those environments incredibly. They were farming them. I couldn't even get the crops to grow when I first started out there. I couldn't work out what to do. And it really started making you think about it. Even in Alaska, where we were being dropped off in the what I thought was the middle of nowhere, we'd seen this peak for ages. We thought, we're going to have to go up there. So we start going for this peak. Of course, there's a bear in the way on the way, so we had to skirt round that. It's the first time I'd been climbing with a thick wool jacket, a pair of heavily oiled canvas trousers, a pair of these welly boots, a massive pack, and a gun on the back. But we got to the top, and we were very proud of ourselves till we found a little tin box with all the people that had been there before. I think the point of the story is really that we're exploring for ourselves, and it's all about what we're learning, what we're gaining, and then how we're using that. And there were people living in all these places that people went off in the age of exploration to see. It wasn't something new. And I think a bit of respect for those people and those cultures and those places is really fundamentally important to really thinking about where exploration ought to be going next. And it's not just about us challenging, it's also about us learning. And the more that we can learn and the more we can spread messages and understanding, then I think the more we'll achieve. And one of the things I do as I go along is to do these little scribble sketches. It's very rare that a sketch takes me longer than half an hour because I'm a bit impatient, so apologies for that. But most of them are pen and ink and watercolour. I don't use a pencil and faff about, it's just straight on, get it down and move on. But as we go through, we'll show you a little bit more. And I've started using this to explore more and more close to home. This is actually the small holding we've got on the Welsh border. We found that just going and poking around in the hedgerows and looking in amongst the grasses and this area where I've now put a lovely big pond in, has become an equally as much of a fascination as all those really crazy places that we went travelling over the years and that we've worked in. Through that, we've started doing these activities with people that you wouldn't initially think of as art. But we've started playing around with this way we observe and the way we get into exploring and thinking about some of the traditional stuff that we were seeing overseas. And that we'd done, I used to work in forestry and conservation work here in the UK before going over to work in Alaska. So I'd done things like green woodworking and lots of sort of traditional country craft. I used to do dry stone walling on the mountains of Snowdonia, build the footpaths, hedge lay. So a lot of those things are actually an art form. I thought this is really interesting. It's starting to get me thinking completely differently about art and my observation and my exploration. And that all these worlds started coming together. And it wasn't anymore about just doing a drawing. It was more about how I was engaging somebody in seeing something differently, interpreting it, and often through very simple activities. And when somebody comes to me and says, can I make a spoon? Or can I make a little three-legged stool? And I think that's wonderful. Usually after about the first 5 minutes, they can't move their hands, so it takes a little bit longer than they'd originally thought. But the point is that they are experiencing the use of the wood. They're learning how it all works, they're observing more, but they're also creating something for them that's very artistic. And if that doesn't look much like a spoon at the end, you know what? I don't care. It really doesn't matter. The important thing was the processes they were going through. So what we're going to do is just talk you through a bit of an example, because we thought we could start with all sorts of crazy stuff. I mean, you probably gathered I don't really do sport to be good at something, I do sport to get somewhere. So I do sketching underwater when I'm scuba diving. I've hung off the rock face when I'm rock climbing and done sketching. When I'm down caving, I'll sometimes sketch using waterproof papers and things. So for me, it's how I get myself to stop and think and look. And I think everybody's doing it in a different way. So I'm going to pass over to Irene, because Irene comes from a slightly different space to me in the way she uses and has developed art. And I think probably slightly unusual for somebody who's also an ultra runner.
My form of art is a form of textiles called tapestry weaving. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of it. You may be familiar if you've been to a stately home and seen tapestries hanging on the wall. That's what I do. But it's not the way that it's been done all those hundreds of years ago, and even by most people today, where it takes days, weeks, even months to create a piece. What I do is I love being outdoors and having the experience of weaving outdoors. And for me, that has been a wonderful way to explore and start to really see what I'm looking at. So the pictures of me here, on your left-hand side, I'm on a beach, and on the other side, I'm literally just on the hill behind our small holding. So I didn't have to go very far from home at all to start that exploration. You look at these pictures, what a wonderful way to spend the day. I had a few hours while my kids were being scouts and running round Havering Forest in mid-Wales. And so I took the dog, she's a very good weaving dog, and made myself comfortable by the shores of Llyn Clywedog. And first, what I did was just sit and look and try and really understand what I could see, and just start to kind of I suppose, get the atmosphere of it, but start to look at what the landscape was. It's not very easy to see. If you look very carefully, you can see the tapestry that I created. That was literally just over 4 hours, a very kind of meditative, relaxing experience where I was able to really look at the shape of the hills. I could see the sheep dotted on the hills. I could see some of the bracken there, which made me think about, well, how's the land managed? But do you know what? The best thing was I just had such a relaxing day. But at the end of it, I'd created something. And every time now that I look at that tapestry, I remember that day that I spent out in mid-Wales. This is another nearly wild weaving day out I had. This was a morning in the rock pools on a beach in South Devon. What I was trying to do here was, rather than look at the very big landscape around me, I was trying to look at something very small. I was looking at just a small portion of a rock pool. Now, that's not something I'm particularly familiar with, so it really got me wondering, well, what's actually going on in this rock pool? Sort of who's eating who? What's growing here? But I started doing that by looking at the colours and the shapes and the textures and the patterns that were there. And that's what I was trying to recreate with my tapestry. Steve mentioned that we go exploring. We've got 2 kids. As you can see, they're looking a bit grim here. This was the beginning of the Tour de Mont Blanc, which we did a few years back. We were not blessed with good weather. This was the start of it, and it didn't get any better. I suspect I'm maybe the only person that's walked the Tour de Mont Blanc with a tapestry weaving kit in their rucksack. What I had intended was that each day while we were walking, we would be stopping off in a wonderful alpine meadow and I'd be able to sit and weave for a couple of hours. However, the weather had other ideas. I did end up weaving every day, but more often than not it was in the shelter of the refuge once we'd arrived, having tried to make good observations as we were going through. This was one day where Steve had done a very quick watercolour and I'd done an absolutely tiny little tapestry, but trying to get the essence of the colours of the landscape. But these were some of the things that inspired me, but also got me thinking. Those sheep on the right-hand side, we came across them one morning, literally, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes after leaving the refuge. We were just walking down the hillside, flock of sheep, didn't think too much about it. We have our own flock of sheep, Jacob's sheep. These were clearly something different. A little bit further on, we met what turned out to be the shepherd coming back up the mountain. We took the time to have a chat with him. Turned out those were merino sheep. I'd never noticeably seen a merino sheep before, but having spoken to the shepherd and got some understanding of how he managed his flock, it then made me think twice, because I don't know about you, but I use merino stuff when I'm outdoors, and it is the most amazing, has the most amazing properties. So it had kind of felt as if I was getting that link through, back to where it came from. The cow on the bottom left-hand side, my daughter said to me, this was in Switzerland, she said to me, wouldn't it be lovely if you could do a tapestry weaving of this cow? And she very quickly whipped off a cartoon cow, expected me to weave it, and it took me 3 days of evenings in the refuge. But it did actually make me think about cows and what they did in the landscape and why they were there and actually what they looked like. The roof tiles on the right-hand side, we ended up having quite a long conversation about the architecture and where people got their building materials from, because it was the shape of those roof tiles that had got me thinking from an artistic point of view. It's not all about being far away from home. This is one of our sheep, and I'd wanted to do... I'd been mulling over how to sort of represent some of what we had in our small holding through the tapestry weaving. And I also had been visiting the V&A Museum in London, which, if any of you ever feel so inclined, if you beetle all the way up to the top and along to the back, which most people never do, there is a big room there with some amazing medieval tapestries. So what I then did was turned this contemporary sheep into a medieval sheep. So if you go along to see any sort of tapestries hanging in a stately home, the kind of way that those flowers are represented, the way the grasses are represented, is how they would have done them in medieval times. Now, whether we've got that sort of botany on our land is another matter. We have been out exploring with some botanists. Steve actually is quite good at that sort of thing himself. But what I was trying to do was give that kind of representation of what we'd got on our land. When we're thinking about exploring through art, there are a number of different, I suppose, artistic directions you can come from, one of which is colour. Until you actually start looking properly at colour, I don't think you really appreciate it. I certainly didn't until I was trying to work out, what colour am I looking at? How am I going to represent that with the yarns that I've got? This was an exercise that I did on our small holding in December, I think it is, which is not a time of year that you would think was going to be particularly promising for colour. But isn't it fabulous? I was able to collect, I was going to do the exercise outside. I started outside and it was so perishing cold I had to go inside. But what I did was I collected a whole variety of things and then sat inside and tried to represent those colours first in pastels, which was quite challenging because I don't have that kind of artistic training, but it really made me look at the colours and then try and say, well, I'm a textile artist, I work in yarn, how can I show that in yarn? So that's what that exercise was all about. It's not just colour that you think about in art, it's also line. There are some fabulous lines out there if you go exploring. These are some lines variously. The one on the left is reflections I saw recently on a lake near Blenheim Palace. The ones on the right, I used to walk past every morning when I was walking into the village along our canal towpath. You know, really eye-catching. Actually what they were was sort of 3 telegraph lines above us, but once you look at them reflected in the water, aren't they fascinating? And then the one in the middle is lines in the sand. And that's the sort of thing that some years ago, before I started looking at things with an artist's eye when I was outdoors, I don't think I'd have properly noticed, but now that's the kind of thing that catches my eye. So, you know, you can be exploring when actually all you're doing is just having a wander on the beach. This is going back to the ultra running. These are all pictures that I've taken when I've been out running. I do actually, when I'm running, spend quite a lot of time thinking about, oh, I could weave that. And it's also a very good excuse when you're completely knackered and out of breath to stop and take a picture and pretend that that's what, you know, that's what you're doing it for. But actually it also gives me lots of time to mull over what I'm seeing and think about it. So here, on the left-hand side, that's the southwest coast path, just coming out of Salcombe towards Bolt Head. Isn't it beautiful? On the right-hand side, again, not very far from home, that's the Braithen Hills. There's some fascinating folklore that surround those hills that once you actually start spending lots of time in places, you start to think, oh, I wonder what the history of that's all about. The one in the middle, I very rarely run in urban areas, but for me, that actually presented from an artistic point of view quite a striking set of shapes and lines, as well as that path going through the middle. So you actually, again, start to see things quite differently, because in itself you think, well, that's got no particular interest, but actually looking at it from an artist's point of view, something a bit different there. This set of photographs here is about textures. One of the joys of working with yarn in tapestries is that you can actually do some really interesting things to play around with texture. And you can look at the very big scale stuff, you can look at the very small scale stuff. So the picture on the left-hand side, we think is a very small jellyfish. I don't know if anybody's got any other thoughts on that one. That was last weekend on the beach in Aberdyfi in West Wales. There were some very, very big jellyfish, but we think this might be their baby cousin. When you're looking at texture, in that photograph, what I really think is interesting is the juxtaposition of the shininess of our little baby jellyfish and the grittiness of the sand. You could have some really interesting times playing around with that in different sort of mediums of art, trying to do something with that. In the middle, the reflections of those leaves, their shininess, but it's a different sort of shininess. And then on the right-hand side, that kind of sort of shimmery reflection, again, another different sort of shininess. And all that's out there if you just take the time to look. Some of these things are that as a tapestry weaver, whilst I weave something relatively quickly in a few hours as opposed to the months of the medieval weavers, actually there are some things that if you take a photograph of, you manage to just capture that moment. And that's sort of that photograph on the right-hand side. If I stayed there to try and weave that, I'd have lost it because the light would have changed. This is coming back to colour. I showed you a colour exercise I'd done. This is just a very quick example of how much colour variety you can see. This is only looking at leaves. All of these photographs were taken on the same day, and this was just me keeping my eye out whilst I was out for a run. I guess I was running with a weaverly eye, and all of these different sorts of things caught my eye as the colour of the natural world that was around me, and actually really added to the experience that I was having. It did actually make it far more of an exploration rather than just a training run. I am also interested in light, and if you look, with an artist's eye, the way light comes through leaves is endlessly fascinating. Haven't yet woven any of these, but I'd like to have a go at it at some point. But it's not just light, it's shadow as well. This was an early morning shot, or series of shots, on the beach up on an island called Westray it's one of the northern isles of Orkney. And the shadow created by the early morning sun on those sand patterns is just stunning. From a tapestry weaving point of view, those sort of sinuous shapes are, the medium is really well suited to that. But again, it gets you thinking about how was the water actually behaving on that beach? What is it that actually created those shapes? So a simple walk along the beach actually becomes a bit of a deeper exploration and experience. The next picture, which is the Beast of Llanymynech. Now, this was something which, if you ever come to the small village of Llanymynech, which is on the Shropshire-Wales border, it has the unique distinction of being divided by the England and Wales border. On the English side, there is an old lime processing kiln, and it's a special sort of circular kiln, which I won't go into detail now, Hoffman kiln. If you stand at one end of it and look down the kiln, this is what it looks like. And I had never noticed it like that before until somebody who had come out weaving with me said, that could be an evil bird beast coming to get you. And I just thought, isn't that wonderful? That's what looking differently at the world around you through an artistic eye can bring.
Until 5 years ago, she didn't do art. She knew nothing about it, and she couldn't do art. I think you'd struggle to believe it after that. Irene now uses more fancy language about what we're seeing than I ever did, and I've been sketching ever since I can remember. But maybe just gives a few insights. I'm just going to take us back into another way of thinking about how we're using our art and exploring. So Irene uses a lot about the patterns, the shapes, the colours, the spaces, the things that she's seeing, and then exploring into it. I'm often coming at it from a quite different background. So as you probably gathered, I actually started out life as an ecologist. I was lucky enough to be the head forester for North Wales for the National Trust. I probably have to say that since we're in trust land. I spent quite a lot of time looking at landscape and how we've shaped and created spaces over time. So a lot of my art is actually investigating and trying to understand something. And by the act of drawing and working through it, I start to interpret it and understand it much better. And I found that I can then apply that when I'm working overseas. So I was sitting I was working actually out on Lake Tanganyika with local people in the villages. Yes, I do speak Swahili. So I was speaking with them about the area along the side of the river and how that's developed and worked. And I couldn't get a semblance of sense amongst the whole group of the village about how this space was really used and working. And it wasn't until I sprung on the idea of pulling out a big pad that I had in my backpack and sketching a cartoon that everything started to come together. Because what I did is started to talk about the river and how the river had changed, where the diseases were happening, where people were having a problem with their livestock, and through drawing it all out in a cartoon, which ended up becoming a huge thing on the ground because we couldn't fit it all on the paper, we started to understand why a lot of the problems were happening. So to give you a very quick feel of how that process of using the art worked, I start by saying, okay, you're telling me that you've got a lot of problems with certain key diseases like yellow fever, typhoid, so on. Why do we think they're happening? And what was happening at a basic level was cattle were being driven in across the river area. That was leading to a lot of silt going into the waterways. All the vegetation along the side of the river had been damaged. All that silt is going out into the bay, and it's forming thick muds. And those muds were then harbouring all sorts of disease and bacteria because they were sitting there for a long period of time without any interference, and the only interference was people going in basically using the toilet. So effectively it was telling that story of why that landscape had formed and why those problems were happening. So the very simple use of the art had changed the way people were thinking about their landscape and how they were managing it. And since then I've used a lot of cartooning for exactly that reason, to help people understand. I think we're going to wrap it up about there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed. If you liked it, subscribe. If you didn't like it, leave a reason in the comments as to why.